So we all have heard of climate change, and the news have been kind of very prominent lately, and there is absolutely hard evidence that the next 10 years will affect the next 10,000 years. And it's down to each one of us to actually take action. Let me just rephrase this. No pay lip service, really take action.
So the first question I'd like to pose to all of you, if you can just give us your insights, is looking back on the last decade, what do you feel that we've done really well, and what still, for each of you is the most important thing that we're facing now in the next decade?
If we look at the last decade, it's a very interesting decade in the sense that you also have to look at a geopolitical context. You had the Millennial Development Goals, and then you had in 2015 groundbreaking work on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that for the first time in history 193 countries agree on a common agenda to leave no one behind. And I think that's really good news that we have this 2030 agenda, that we know what we need to do and how we need to get there. It will need a lot of action, and I think if we see what we did well is I think we have evolved from a concept of sustainability where it's often a very reactive approach and not a proactive approach. And I think often in the past 10 years, I saw some organizations that kind of started a project here and there, did some philanthropic initiatives. I think those times are gone. I think that there's really a mind shift to say, well, your strategy should be, one strategy. And that brings a whole different dynamics. And then there's the consumer. The consumer and consumer confidence. I think in any industry, if it's fashion, diamonds, gold, it's all about product integrity. So I think we're moving away from the very traditional concept, and we're definitely looking at partnerships because we know that these supply chains are long and complex, so you can't do it alone.
At the high level, thinking about it as a businessman or an investor, I think that having earlier on in the 20th century, defeated communism, capitalism surged ahead, and it eventually, by the last decade, begun to take some responsibility for its actions. Fortunately, it took more concerted effort to engage in civil society, but also to look at environmental consequences. That response, unfortunately, has been a linear response. It's probably coming a decade, maybe too late, for a linear response to be effective against what is now an exponential challenge, which is primarily climate change, but also oceans and species loss. So, there has been a response. I'll just say that this response needs to now be exponential. Business now has to start to re-engage with not-for-profits and most importantly with governments, because we can't get, this is like a systemic challenge. It's an overused phrase, but we will not get, even with all the power and the resources and of business, which can be a force for good, it cannot do it alone and needs to stop trying to do it alone. And so business and finance has to reintegrate into civil society and into public sector and try and capacity build there and work with other sectors of the economy, as I said, to try and adopt more of an exponential response to this challenge.
And building on that point, and many of those points, I think there are reasons to be positive. The consumer trend is positive. Some governments have embraced policies, which is positive, but we also know that both governments and consumers are fickle. They are trend and short-termist in their approach. And they can drop something if it's politically convenient, or they can drop something if the price is good. So we can't rely on both. But the really powerful, and I think the most positive aspect of the last 10 years has been both scientific and financial. The science now in this area is earning its real credibility badges. The amount of data that we have now that reveals truths, that puts transparency on government or corporate positions about their own behavior means that these organizations, these governments can no longer hide the facts. So the science is such an important aspect in how you progressively and in the long term move forward with the right decisions. Just because a new technology comes out, in recycling or compostability doesn't mean it's good. It needs to be based in science and fact. And that is one of the most important things. And secondly, the financial markets have or particularly these kind of financial markets, those long-term investors, have a long-term view. And so anything that is going to be a stranded asset in 10 or 15 years' time, they're not going to get the investment. So having the backing of the financial markets, the largest pension funds, the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, to really get behind divestment on one side or investment on the other is really positive. And that's not a short-term trend. That's not a thing that disappears, if you'll agree. So to have science and finance behind this movement, I think is something very positive for the next decade.
So my next question is, because, I mean, as we know, we can't rely on government. The responsibility really does rest with businesses and with individuals to drive change. But the question is the how-to, because we have lots of business leaders in the room, people who run businesses. What would be, perhaps you can each give an insight into the sort of a practical implementation of that, because what does that mean in a day-to-day running of a business? How do we become corporate activists?
If I look at our industry, and if I look at the work the Responsible Jewellery Council does with its 1,200 member companies around the world, you know, from the biggest brands to a small manufacturer in India or Africa or Thailand, we see it as, first of all, sustainability is a part of continuous improvement, because in an imperfect world, you know, you can't be perfect. But that doesn't mean you should not have the leadership at the top to start that commitment. Second is you need a framework. And when we look at a framework, you need an integrated framework. You need an aspect of human rights, labor rights, environmental impact, etc. And you need to measure. And when we look at, for example, the code of practices that was developed for the RJC when we were founded in 2005, it took a lot of consultation, and it looked also a lot at evolution of regulatory framework, etc. And so what we see is that companies really need to take a step-by-step approach, understand their supply chain, where are the biggest risks, and I exactly confirm what you're saying. We see more and more people look at climate as a big business risk, looking at continuity for business. So all these elements have to be, you know, mapped out. And another component I think is critical is that they can't do it alone. So what we also see is a big shift in what we call transformative partnerships on suppliers, where you will have, you know, competitors, you will have different players in the market that are really working together because they are in a certain region and they want to develop that region. So to come back to your question, you know, step-by-step approach, you need a framework, it needs to be integrated, and it needs to be measured. I really, the point of data, if you want to show progress, knowing is showing. And we go back to that consumer. The consumer wants to understand the authentic story behind a company.
And just to add to that, our experience, what could be a very complex, difficult thing to embrace can be very, very simple. This is a new area for many business leaders. They're not necessarily experts in this. So the SDGs in 2016 were wonderful. In giving people a foundation to start with. And that's what we did in 2016. We said, right, how does our business profile, our business context and our capabilities fit with those? Which are the SDGs that matter most or that we can contribute to? So we selected 3, 4, 5 of those to say, right, those are the ones that matter most to us and our business and that we can influence. And then from that, you develop sort of an action plan based on goals. Right, well, if this is our carbon footprint, if this is our diversity quotient, if this is our waste disposal number, well, let's set a target to improve it and go for it. And the science and the data behind that is important. The second thing, the most important, is not to have this strategy in silo with the business objectives. Or rather in silo outside of the business objectives. As soon as that happens, it's an add-on, it's a distraction, it's a cost, and nobody's interested. Certainly not the CFO. But if we turn it around and say, right, these strategies are a way to accelerate our path towards our financial goals, everybody's interested. And that's when it becomes much more a part of the DNA of the organization. How can you, instead of risk mitigation, put sustainability in the guise of accelerating your business and making it a much more enjoyable business for staff, a profitable business for investors, and a valuable business for your customers?
And that has certainly helped us. Our CFO is one of the biggest evangelists for this cause now as a result of that. And to that point, this idea of being a sort of an evangelist for the climate on one side and a sort of a financier on the other, we've joined the two. So we've got a sort of a cohort of people in the organization we call pragmatic evangelists. They are powerful voices and they want to kick doors down and they wear Extinction Rebellion badges, but at the same time they recognize that numbers do matter. And you can't just stop this because all those staff will be affected or all that community will be affected. You've got to be pragmatic in how you evangelize this within a business. And that's some of the lessons that we've learned.
One of the areas that we're quite focused on as an investor is any dissonance or difference between how corporations are portraying their strategy and their interaction with their lobby groups at an industry level. I'm a board member of Conservation International. In the document, you'll see an interview with my CEO, Sanjan. And one of the things I did a little while ago was kind of formalize our engagement strategy with the fossil fuel industry. And key to that was not just holding our partners in the fossil fuel industry, the ones we've selected, accountable for their own actions, is to also track how they behave as part of lobby groups.
Iris, I wanted to draw on a point that you, and when you all read the report, you'll see this, there was, you had 3 specific calls to action for business. And there was a very strong focus there around companies adopting a gender-inclusive lens to the way that they operate. Can you expand on that a little bit more? And then perhaps Mark, you can also, because I know it's an important point for you as well.
Yes, I think that's, this touches SDG 5. I think it's natural that this should be a priority for all. For those of you who are following the Davos news, it's going to take now over 200 and, I think if I'm not mistaken, 250 years to get this equal participation. I think that's not acceptable. But it needs change. I mean, we were talking about governments. There are sometimes regulatory barriers that need to be tackled, but that's not an excuse for the private sector to step in. And we see often that there's still a lot of conscious or unconscious bias or not the right culture yet in an organization to develop that framework. And I can only share my good experience, for example, with the women empowerment principles. This is a set of principles, well thought of, to say you can do an assessment, look at your organization, and say where you are. And then one point I still would like to share is that if you think about it, and you look, for example, at the Oxfam report, that every year, millions of women around the world are, functioning billions of hours, getting water. Climate is hitting on them because, it takes a lot more time, or they cannot get back to their families. There are a lot of development issues. And I think that will be the big opportunity for any organization, wherever you invest, to contribute within your supply chain to development of the local communities. And when women thrive, we know that communities thrive. I mean, that is a fact. Yes, if we talk about step-by-step action, I would invite you to start with the Women Empowerment Principles assessment. And then, of course, it's all about leadership at the top and embracing that vision of gender equality.
But just to add to that point, SDG 5 is, I think, the most important of all the SDGs, because if you get that right, all the other things are easier to achieve. And it's interesting coming from a Japanese company where some social credentials might not be what we might expect in the West. There is much more progress socially to be made in Japan than maybe in other Western companies and countries. And we recognize that. We're actually doing relatively well, which is good news. But the opportunity for us to do really well and influence other Japanese companies, that's sort of my goal, in a sense. About 3 years ago, we banned all ivory and other products of endangered species from our platforms around the world. Amazingly, we were still doing it in some places, but we banned it 2.5 years ago, which is great. And not long after that, lots of other Japanese companies started following suit. So there's a real following principle going on in Japan. So if we can get our basic principles right, get some gender parity here, the opportunity to influence other companies, particularly in areas distant from here, then that's really exciting. And that's one of the things, it's almost the most important incentive for us. Yes, we can change what we're doing as individuals. We can pick up litter, we can shop consciously. But really, does that make a difference? Actually, yeah, of course not really. But what it does do is influence others. If you pick up a piece of litter, if you shop consciously, if you employ consciously, that's a small difference. But it is our duty then to show others what we're doing, and then that one action can influence hundreds of people and hundreds of other decisions. And that's why I think action is so important, not just because of the material effect it has, it's the domino effect it has. And that's where I think the responsibility lies.
So the issue of gender is something that's very important to us, a generation, not just as a partnership. We started off, there was 6 white males, I was one of them. We then hired another 3 white males, and so we arrived with 9 white male partners, and we thought, well, hang on, how exactly did this happen? So if we fast forward now, we have 29 partners, 11 of them are females. Half of the business heads are working mothers. So far, incremental progress. We're not quite at parity yet as a partnership. Looking at investments, it's too much, not enough, but too much proportionate focus on gender is at the recruitment stage. I think we can all do a better job at that, but I think far more important is the development of women leaders in an organisation and removal of obstacles for progress within. And most of that is around the way that organisations manage their time, and also the process of encouraging and onboarding working mothers. So I think working mothers is like a huge open goal, particularly for talent scarce organisations, technology, healthcare, consumer businesses. Most of the discrimination that happens in the workplace actually doesn't happen in the workplace. It happens in the home, where you're basically, 2 parents who both work are forced to choose based on time. That pretty much predetermines career paths within many organisations. So organisations need to think about how they work on flexibility, flexi-working, and in order to make sure that women don't get lost in the middle of their career because they go off and have babies. I think organisations need to adopt a much more integrated, proactive approach towards this. They need to think about women's career prospects in a sensitive way, and that way they'll end up with talented, loyal women working in the upper echelons of their business. And as I said, it's just a huge open goal for many businesses.
So my next question is, because we've all touched on it, around the awareness. This last decade's resulted in individuals becoming very aware of the crisis we face and how they have been starting to take action. Extinction Rebellion and organizations like that are a prime example of how people are mobilizing. But there's also a lot of greenwashing still in the market, and that was really was very clear to me when I was reading the report, when you talk about carbon offsetting and single-use plastic versus paper, and people who are saying they're carbon neutral. How do we navigate this landscape? Who do we look to in terms of accreditations? And how do we know that we're not just getting caught up in the latest positive trend, where something that starts out with good intentions actually lands up having a negative impact?
I'm going to look at it from the RJC perspective. When we talk about greenwashing, because it's also defining greenwashing, we know what we look. All industries are facing the same sometimes challenge that companies should really be authentic what they're telling, and also in that narrative. We see that many companies are starting to embrace the agenda on climate, but there's also sometimes, I would say, a lack of education, and that's not to sound negative, but there needs to be more clarification, practical toolkits. How do I start the journey? You have some advanced leaders there who are so innovative. We have a circular economy model who bring up a new product that is fully with recycled materials, etc. And this is all. These trends are shaping the industry, but many also say, well, I don't know how to start the journey. So we believe there's a huge opportunity to educate and bring awareness. We look at it from our perspective in our code of practices. Environmental impact is a critical chapter, and we will we work with other partners to help companies on on that journey on environment. But it needs to be also measurable. And I think there you will see some people are talking about offset, others say we don't know how to show that progress. It's about scoping. So what I see is still a lot of challenges ahead. Yeah.
So my industry is in the midst of an enormous kind of wave of ESG and SRI, and most of it is a marketing-led initiative, partly because the active fund management industry, you don't need to know the details, is kind of having a bit of a crisis of legitimacy, and they're kind of thrashing around looking for something to hang on to retain clients. So there's a lot of good coming from it, but the marketing spin is meaningfully ahead of the actual actions, and so it's quite troubling. I would say that at a business level, what I'd like to see is companies integrating their sustainability initiatives into their competitive strategy, instead of looking at it trying to cover the bases and tick boxes. They need to kind of integrate it into how they're actually competing, how they're planning on taking market share, how they're planning on retaining and winning clients. So it has to be something that's close to the business and is talked about in the same way as you would talk about new product launches or anything else, key financial metrics. So businesses have to make this central. The final thing I'd say is that for many large corporations, it's hard for them to really understand how consumers are seeing this, but they've typically got some pretty smart and informed internal constituents. And so employee surveys and engagement there needs to be a big focus on the extent to which the employees of an organization who've are in a great position to judge really buy into the initiatives and actually believe that they're authentic. I think that'd be the one thing. If I could just find one piece of information in every company, if I could just see the employee surveys and whether or not the employees actually believe that these projects are initiatives, that'd be the one thing I would look for.
And from an investment perspective, do you think we could reach a point where companies would be excluded from the consideration from the investment community if they're not sustainable, if they're not really?
That's happening right now,
Okay.
particularly around climate. I mean, that's increasingly becoming a reality in the equity world, less so in the debt world. But in the equity world, that's increasingly becoming a reality. Some combination of exclusion from an equity investment, plus also talent attrition that is the pincer movement for big companies. If they don't get ahead of that, they will lose their best people, and the investors will become narrower and less engaged, and that's probably not a good thing.
For each of you, what is the key takeaway or the piece of information that you would really like everybody to leave with today?
2020 is it's a decade of, I think, trust and radical transparency, and we'll only be able to do that in partnerships. So I think this is a call for action to work more closely together within your industry, but also across industries, to learn, build synergies that we really can contribute to development on the ground.
So I guess, in a sense, I think personalizing this makes the most important difference, because if we as individuals have a purpose, then the organizations that we work for might adopt that purpose, or at least you can be a warrior for purpose within your own organization. And even if purpose does exist, sometimes it's not happening nearly fast enough or nearly embraced enough by enough people within the organization. So to find your own purpose is, I think, important. And there's a wonderful concept called Ikigai, which is a Japanese, forgive me if you've heard me talking about this before, which is originated in Japan, and it's this idea about life's worth. And I think it's as true for companies as much as it is for individuals, that if you can find something that you do in life that you're good at, you love doing, you get paid for, and is of worth, it's of value to the world, then you've got Ikigai. And it's possible to have part-time Ikigai as well. You don't have to do it the whole time. But to have some form, to be on the journey towards Ikigai yourself, means that what you do at work with others, in your family, with your colleagues, with your bosses, with your projects, you infuse that worth, that purpose into that work. And if you can do that, then you start behaving very differently. And I think if we can individually find Ikigai, then it's much more much more logical for companies to adopt it too, and then for those companies to be to become worthwhile too. And only when companies become worthwhile do they actually move the needle on all of these issues.
Speaking very personally as a father of four, someone who flies around the world on planes, lives in a big house with cars, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity and the systemic nature of what we face. I think you have to kind of adopt a three-pronged strategy. You should try and take a responsibility for your footprint and your actions. Some of that will be unavoidable, and some of it will be avoidable. On the other hand, you also need to lean in and start to make, from a purpose perspective, make this a feature of your, not just your own personal consumption and behavior, but also the way you advocate, the way you vote, the memberships, whether it be political or social. Get involved if it matters to you. And then whatever your business life is, look to basically make it a feature of your business, and make a feature of whether, even if you don't get to dictate how your business is run, agitate internally for your business to evolve this way. So you can't just reduce it down to, well, I'm going to have to fly 5 times a year, so I might as well give up. You need to kind of like weave it into the whole package. Giving in is not an option. Even if we don't succeed in the next 10 years in bending the curve, we can't just cast future generations, to the wastelands because we've chosen that we may be too late to make a big difference in the next, 1 or 2 generations. So you can't get overwhelmed. You can't get despair is not an option. You've just got to basically try and do your bit and progressively raise that over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.